It's my pleasure and honor to welcome you, Emily. Emily Grabham joins us from the Kent Law School at the University of Kent, where she is Professor of Law and co-director of the Research and Innovation Division for the Study of Law, Society, and Social Justice. Besides her studies in law at Cambridge University, Queen's University, Canada, and Kent University, she holds a master's degree in gender, society, and culture, and in creative writing. Thus, Emily Grabham is a social legal scholar with a strong agenda in gender studies and feminist theory. Her research interests are in labor and employment law, and the interrelationship of law and time, that is the temporal notion of legal processes and the impact law has on the perception of time and the temporalization of social processes. Emily has published widely and she has engaged in several research projects. I will mention now only a few which connect perfectly, I think, to the thematic scope of our own research and our conference this day. In her book, Brewing Legal Times, Things, Forms, and the Enactment of Law, published 2018 at University of Toronto Press, Emily Grabham advocates for a praxeographic approach of law and time and shows impressively how she draws on methods and perspectives from sociology and social anthropology in her research. With her research, she explores how to understand the relationship between time and things in legal processes. It is the world-making capacities of law and the subjective experiences of those encountering law and legal procedures she explores in detail. Furthermore, we see a close connection to our own endeavors when Emily Grabham insists on the interrelatedness of ontologies and legal processes. Currently, she is co-investigator of the project Future of Legal Gender, FLAG, as I would pronounce it, funded by the Economic and Social Research Council from 2018 until this year. The project asks for the effects and consequences a radical reform may have. Should gender fade in signification, become a matter of personal choice, define new ways of living and being, or remain a category of domination and inequality? The research group published a special issue on these questions and the future of legal gender in the open access journal Feminists at Law, exploring the feminist politics of decertification. In the book Intersectionality and Beyond, Law, Power, and the Politics of Location, that Emily Grabham edited together with Davina Cooper, Jane Krishnatz, and Didi Herman, Emily Grabham contributes with a text on intersectionality. She interrogates the effects the widely established concept of intersectionality has as a technique of governance. With her case studies from her time as legal advisor for the London-based organization Lesbian and Gay Employment Rights, she points at possibilities to rely on intersectionality beyond governmentally produced identity categories. Today, Emily will speak to us about the crafty power of text, the feminist ethnography of legislative drafting. We are very pleased that you accepted, as I said before, our invitation and curious to learn what you have brought with you. After the talk, we have some time for a Q&A, but now, Emily, please receive the virtual welcoming applause from all participants of our conference, and the floor and the mic is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Binder and Professor Baer, for a fantastic introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. And I hope everybody can see that now. I'm going to play it from the start. Okay, so just responding to the amazing introduction we've just had to the really rich research that's going on in this research group and the very insightful ways that both Professor Binder and Professor Justice Baer have talked about the pressing need for interdisciplinary studies of law and gender, I wanted to make a couple of observations about how I might seek to contribute to that rich work through looking at legislative drafting and statutes, because it may from the outset seem to be a step backwards to the very rich work that you've outlined. You have talked about the extent to which the work that's going on across these institutions in interdisciplinary settings have focused on the social lives of law, the need to understand law in its social context, the need to understand the effects that law has on people's lives, their experiences of inequality, their experiences of gender, and the need to do that using social sciences, humanities, and ethnographic research. In particular, Professor Baer talked about putting law on stage. And so what I wanted to raise today is a set of questions about really whether we're confident enough as socio-legal scholars and as feminist legal scholars to turn the gaze back at law itself. And so what I'm trying to do today is to think about the extent to which it's possible to turn back to the text of law and to understand the power of the text of law and to understand the power of statute as something that with our research skills and our socio-legal awareness, we can do something with. So my starting points are this. My starting points are, first of all, understanding gender in diverse and multiple ways. So I have a quote from the queer theorist Eli Clare here, who says, "What I really want is for all the many gendered possibilities in the world to be not normal, but rather profoundly ordinary and familiar." So that's kind of setting in which we understand gender as multiple and as non-normative, but ordinary at the same time. So with this understanding of gender, another thing that I would like to ask today is whether we can start to use this socio-legal awareness that we've got to understand legal form in a new way, whether we can turn the gaze back on legal form. So, for example, the legal anthropologist Annalise Riles has said of legal form that we can speak of legal categories and techniques as generative of certain kinds of social, political, and epistemological realities. So that really speaks to the extent to which the research that's going on amongst members of the manufacturing collectivities group and the conference is really able to focus on what law creates just as much as how gender itself is created as a set of social ontologies. Another set of starting points is really to say that my hunch is that legislative drafting techniques have consequences for feminists. I don't know what exactly those consequences are, and so that's what my research is seeking to investigate. But I know from research done by others, for example, by research by the legal scholar Sandra Peterson, that legislative drafters have helped usher in specific legal and textual formations with attached ontologies of gender that have travelled far into social life. So by focusing on what kind of formations and ontologies of gender exist within statutes and focusing on where they move between different statutory texts, we can understand something different about the social power of law. So one of my questions is, how do techniques of drafting support complex, wider social processes of gendering? So I'm going to set out 3 scenes of feminist inquiry, and each of these scenes might look different in a civil law context to a common law context. And so I'd really welcome in the Q&A session at the end, debate about that, debate about the kind of common law centricity of what I'm about to propose and the ways in which there are distinct jurisdictional differences that have to be borne in mind. So the first is that in having a hunch that legislative drafting was important for feminists, I set out to interview as many legislative drafters who would agree to be interviewed. And part of the reason for interviewing them was that at one point I was doing research on women in precarious work, and I wanted to understand something of the technicalities that were helping to shape their work through the kind of restrictions on the rights that they could claim. So I went to talk to legislative drafters, and since then I've carried on trying to interview legislative drafters. And what happens is that they will talk very eloquently about the work that they put into drafting statutes. They will talk about the technical challenges. They will talk about the conflicts that they have. So it's interesting to think of legislative text as being conflictual and alive in the way that Professor Baer was talking about social conflict before. So many drafters talk about conflict, and they talk about the way that they gain their expertise and what that expertise consists of. But there's always a point in the conversation where they look confused when the reason why I'm interested in what they have to say. They don't feel that in relation to what they see as the substantive content of the statute, they don't feel that they have anything to say about that, or that they should have anything to say about that. Now, I find this very, very interesting. And in fact, the legal anthropologist Alain Potage has recently written quite nicely about this in an article published in Feminists at Law. And he really put his finger on the point here. He says, doctrinally, legislative authorship is supposed to be merely instrumental, to efface itself in the service of political purpose. However intelligent or creative it is, drafting always plays juridical shadow to political substance. And I feel that that comment is very insightful, because it really captures what those drafters have been telling me over the years. And that quotation was backed up by work done by the political scientist Edward Page, who interviewed drafters from the Office of the Parliamentary Council in London. And this is one quote from an article that Edward Page published in 2009. So this drafter said, "Our remit is to be mere technicians, to put into a legal form the policy idea generated elsewhere." So my first scene of inquiry is to try to think carefully about why it is that the work of legislative drafters is in the shadows. What does this shadowy position of drafters do to our understanding of the power of legal knowledge? The second set of inquiries is to understand what it does when we say that statutes merely contain substantive political propositions that have been settled outside of the drafting process. So going back to my example of researching with women in precarious work, what I noticed was that many women talked about feeling too new to claim employment rights. And they talked about feeling too new quite late on in their employment. So there is a qualifying limit on many family-friendly rights in the UK, and that is normally about 26 weeks. But none of the women that I interviewed said that they knew about this limit, but they did talk about feeling too new to draw on relative rights. And so I wanted to know what was happening here. I went and interviewed legislative drafters about how they'd constructed the limits, the 26-week qualifying period. And they talked about the 26-week period being something that would help the employer establish loyalty on the part of employees. But given that the women themselves didn't know the text of the law, I wanted to know whether the feeling of newness was in some way a ghostly analogue, socially created. It was somehow, there was a ghostly life that the qualifying period as a legislative technique was having on their lives. But obviously, anybody who does interdisciplinary legal research would realise that there is a vast difference between the legislative text and the lives of women, with lots of intermediaries, lots of different people acting in lots of different ways. But I wanted to understand, what does this newness and this qualifying period suggest about the social power of drafting techniques themselves? So the legislative drafting expert, Helen Zantharki, talks about the crucial measure for the quality of legislation being that it does what it says on the tin, And she says, doing what it says on the tin is whether it achieves its purpose clause in the case of common law, or whether it achieves the will of the legislator in the case of civil law. Now, I have got a picture of a tin from Andy Warhol's work from the 1960s, because I want to understand how this set of propositions interacts with this idea of shadowiness that we saw in the first feminist inquiry. What does it mean to say that statute is a tin for political substance? What is the tin itself? What is the tin doing? And taking a step back, I drew again on the work of Anneliese Riles, who herself was influenced by the work of the anthropologist Roy Wagner. And he revolutionized the anthropology of knowledge, as Anneliese Riles puts it, where he demonstrated that the objects that one sees as material and as different from representations are in fact themselves the effects of particular symbolic practices. So here we might say that we might question the moves that we're making in knowledge production that create legislative text as being something objectively different to the political content that is somehow fed into the tin. And so it's those sorts of questions about objectification that I'm interested in exploring in my research. And the final feminist inquiry that I would have in relation to legislative drafting is intelligibility. So once again, Thornton's legislative drafting, which is a professional text used by drafters, very big, says that the obligation to be intelligible, to convey the intended meaning so that it's comprehensible and easily understood, requires the unremitting pursuit of clarity by drafters. Now, drawing on work in anthropology and legal anthropology, I'm interested in what the value of intelligibility actually is and what it does. So where does it come from? How is it constructed and reconstructed? And what social power does it have as a norm or a norm creating practice? And so here I would be drawing on the work of people like, for example, Andrea Ballestero, who's written about transparency as a social value, and the work of Marilyn Strathern, who's written about audit cultures and the value creating practices and ontologies of audit cultures. And I'd also go back to the work of the political theorist Michael Shapiro, who has stated that intelligibility is an ambiguous achievement. So here we'd be looking at the way that intelligibility and what Shapiro calls regimes of intelligibility, how they're created and what contributes to them. So with those three scenes of inquiry in mind, I would now be really interested to look at what are the drafters actually doing. And here I feel that I am very much in conversation with the work of you all, because there's very much an empirical focus to your work, an empirical interdisciplinary focus. So here I'm going to sketch some of the ways I've thought about approaching these questions, and I'd be really keen to hear what you might have to say about this as well. So my sense is that we could explore three main things in relation to legislative drafting. We could look at the status and wider effects of technical legal expertise. We could look at the aesthetics of law, and we could look at the creativity involved in the making of law. And in raising these three questions, what I'm proposing is that even though legislative drafting might seem to be a boring or obvious form of legal practice, my sense is that it's been underexplored in relation to these areas that socio-legal scholars and legal anthropologists have done a huge amount of work on recently. So first, drafting is technical expertise. So we know from the work of many legal anthropologists and social scientists that technical expertise overall is of interest, but technical legal expertise has become a topic of inquiry over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. And so work, for example, by Leila Kawar has looked at how technical legal expertise used by the International Labour Organization bureaucrats in relation to domestic workers legislation was really pivotal. And work by Anneliese Riles has focused on the role of backroom collateral experts and their use of technicalities in relation to contracts over collateral. In much of this work, which is voluminous and incredibly powerful and interesting, what I've been interested to see is that people focus on judges, they focus on bureaucrats, they even focus on everyday technicalities, the way that people in their everyday lives deal with technicalities. But we haven't yet focused extensively on the drafters who in common law jurisdictions draft statutes and regulations, which are the text of law, apart from obviously court judgments. So there's been a bias in favour of courts and judges. So I would be really interested in focusing on the skills, behaviours and identities that drafters cultivate and value. And I'd be interested in following the problems, controversies and mistakes that they encounter and the ways that they respond. In this way, I hope that we would have much more of a lively sense of what the text is and where it's been. So how might we do that? Well, the first is through historical methods and perspectives. And this is not something that I'm very well acquainted with. So I'd be really interested to hear from historians in the group. But what I'd like to propose overall is that we approach statutes as Renisa Mawani suggests we approach law itself as an archive. So instead of thinking that the archive is somewhere else, the archive is perhaps the statutes themselves. And what we know from the work of Sandra Peterson is that in relation to English law in particular, the history of variable sex gender pronouns has been one of the things amongst many other innovations and many other norm creating processes that has led to the apparently obvious contemporary constructions of sex and gender that we see in phrases such as he or she. So those phrases such as he or she in English are very, very common and ubiquitous, but they have come about through controversies, legal developments, and through the structure of the English language itself. And I know that German language considerations are distinct here. So what I'd be interested in finding out is how large-scale law reform projects that happened in England at the height of the British Empire connected ways of understanding gender with colonial legal projects. So Peterson shows how the masculine rule was introduced as part of a set of law reform projects that aimed to see the many different dissipated statutes that were then in existence and bring them together. So there was a lot of work that tried to standardize legal texts and particularly statutes, bring them all together and standardize ways of interpreting those texts. And so the masculine rule, in which the masculine gender was read to include the female gender, was one of those law reform projects. But that was happening at the same time as many different colonial legal projects. So we know, for example, from the work of the critical legal scholar Sarah Keenan, that law reform projects on land title were happening during that time through experimentation in the British colonies. So we might follow how gendered wording and constructions within statutes travelled through the British Empire. This is where I'd like to bring in the work of Douglas Hay and Paul Craven. So Douglas Hay and Paul Craven did an edited collection on the over 100 jurisdictions in the British Empire and the voluminous employment legislation that was brought about within those jurisdictions. And what they wanted to know was how focusing on the statutes might help them understand something about the organisation of empire. So how consistent was this body of law throughout the empire? And what control did the imperial centre exercise over colonial law? And how were statutory provisions and policies transmitted? Now, they did this through particular techniques that I can talk about later. But basically what they did was that they compared the wording in key statutes with the wording in other statutes from other jurisdictions, and they were able to understand something about the level of influence. But of course, it's not just only ever wording, is it? It's legal meaning. So they were able to work out the level of control that different jurisdictions within the British Empire had in relation to each other and the metropolitan centre. But I would be interested in asking, how did these statutes define sex and gender and with what effects? So bringing the work of Sandra Peterson into conversation with the work of Douglas Hay and Paul Craven, how were these sex gender definitions transmitted through the British Empire? So that's how historical methods might help us crack open legal techniques and the way that drafting helps us understand the technical expertise of law in a wider sense. Ethnographic methods have also been very close to my heart as I've tried to understand something of the everyday life of legislative drafters. So my ideal project would be to do an ethnography of the Office of the Parliamentary Council in London, and being able to understand the everyday work of those drafters, the way that they hone their expertise, and the epistemologies of sex and gender that come up in relation to the drafting that they're doing. But the obvious problem with this kind of study is a problem of access. I've tried a couple of times to get that kind of access, and it's not been possible. And I've been wondering whether there's something about observing that work, observing creating the tin, to use the analogy from early on, is whether it's a threat to the power of statutory text. And if it is indeed a threat to the power of statutory text, then that would contradict the idea of drafters saying that they're always in the shadows because they shouldn't matter to the political substance of law. If we were able to bring the drafters out of the shadows, then what would we see? Would we see that their work is very powerful? Would we see that their work is not really consequential? Would this undermine the power of statutory text, or would it actually help us to understand it in a new light? Now, the political scientist Edward Page, whose article I cited earlier on from 2009, had similar problems of access, not entirely the same, but similar problems of access. And he was able to get around that by doing some interviews of legislative drafters and taking a couple of case files from particular statutes and interrogating them to create what he called fictitious narratives. So that's one way of doing it. I've been trying to follow something that I see is similar to being a multi-sited ethnography. And to do that, I've needed to rely on interviews. And the interviews that I've done, that I've been given with OPC legislative drafters, have generally been double interviews. Those have been incredibly helpful because they're almost like mini focus groups. But on the other hand, you do wonder whether drafters have been put in there to observe each other so that they maybe don't give too much away. However, they have been incredibly helpful, those interviews. They've been very in-depth, so I've tried not to use too many prompts. I've tried to allow their own world to come out through the conversation, and they have been enormously helpful in understanding the conflicts and dilemmas that drafters go through in producing their text, and something of the detail of the expertise that they have, which I think is really fascinating. The other big set of questions that I have about legislative drafting is really a question about how understanding statutes can help advance scholarly conversations about legal aesthetics or about the aesthetics of law. The interesting thing about statutes is that they're increasingly oriented by drafters to be seen, read, and interpreted by members of the public. This is not the case. This is not what it used to be the case. It used to be the case that there was an assumption that lawyers would intervene between drafters and the public, and that lawyers would help interpret the statutes. But by putting statutes online, drafters know that these statutes are available to everybody. And I'd be interested in understanding how this is changing their craft. But it also leads to bigger questions. So what does this say about the status of text as the dominant medium of and for law? So, for example, the socio-legal scholar Linda Mulcahy has said that the reification of the authoritative text and written rule has long served to reinforce the idea of law as having an autonomous existence separated from politics, morality, emotion, and the visual. So what do we do when we try to grapple with this powerful relationship between text, law, and visual power? The legal scholar Tom Giddens has said that legal understanding and practice rest upon the assumption that text is merely a vessel that carries the law. Textual appearances only matter insofar as they enable the transmission of content. So if we develop new ways of understanding text and legal text visually, will this help us challenge what I've previously referred to as the obviation of legal form that we see with statute the idea that statute itself is supposed to be only the vessel for law, and that somehow the political substance of it is contained by the statute, but that the statute itself is only a vessel. So I'd like to focus on how legislation takes shape on the page. And I'd like to, drawing on the work, for example, of Marie-Andrée Jacob, I'd like to appreciate the visual power of punctuation in establishing and potentially subverting dominant regimes of intelligibility. So I'm going to show a little video here. You won't hear the sound, but that doesn't matter. So drawing now on the sociologist Dawn Lyon's work on time-lapse photography, what I'd like to suggest is that we might engage with innovative work in the social sciences, for example, Dawn's work, that helps us to understand the rhythms of daily life. So Dawn did an audiovisual montage of time-lapse photography to explore the everyday life of Billingsgate Fish Market. And her work really creates new insights about rhythm, atmospheres, mobility, and market life. What I'd be interested in is whether it would be possible to use similar methods to capture real life or staged drafting sessions, because there's something about seeing that's very important in terms of seeing the way that the text is brought together. What could this tell us also about the gendering power of statute writing? How does gender get woven into statutes? And what does this help us to understand in terms of the power of law? The final set of questions relates to authorship in the making of law. So when I read, for example, Bruno Latour's The Making of Law, in which he focuses on the Conseil d'État and really does incredibly in-depth, lengthy empirical work on how law is created in that setting, I thought it would be amazing to do something similar with legislative drafters, but it's been very difficult. But nevertheless, what both of those projects share is this idea that they help grasp something about how law comes into being. Now, people who are researching law in its wider social context would rightly point out that law comes into being in many social contexts and in many ways. But here I'd like to turn the gaze back on law and try to understand what is happening when people who know that they have some responsibility for making or drafting law, they know somewhere that there's some responsibility there, what do they think they're doing at that moment? And the interesting thing about this is that there's long been an overlap between drafters and writers. So, for example, many writers were involved in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in the Irish Brehon system, the judges were often also poets. And so these sorts of links are really interesting. And in fact, many drafters have actually written or spoken themselves about the extent to which what they do, is it an art or a craft or a technique? And it's very, very difficult to kind of break it apart. And one of the ways in which I think we can try to get at whether the artiness of the craft of legislative drafting is through using work in literary theory, for example. So the literary theorist Hannah Sullivan has published a book called The Work of Revision, in which she says she really focuses on how revision came into being as a really extensive literary practice at the point of high modernism, which in the UK was the point just after World War II in the 1950s and 60s with the modernist poets. And she says that the association of revision and literary value is the legacy of high modernism and the print culture that nourished it. What's really interesting about targeting how revision came about as a social practice is that we're not just assuming that everybody has always revised, and we're not just assuming that revision happens the same way in different social contexts. So I would be interested in understanding what drafters think revision actually is, and whether there are some overlaps to be made, to be teased out between revision in creative writing and revision in legislative drafting. Now, the final part of my presentation today focuses on feminists making statutes, because as a feminist legal scholar, I've always got one set of thoughts live on on how might we do this ourselves, or what does this mean for the activists who I know of, many activists who I know of, who are either engaged in advising on law reform projects and the writing of laws around the world, or who've actually started to do it themselves. Now, in this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the latter because the former group is too numerous even to kind of comprehend. But what happens when feminists themselves try to write statutes? So I'm going to take you very briefly through 3 projects that I'm aware of or have been involved in. And the first is the Writing Law Project. And this was an application, an unsuccessful application to the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council, where the intention was to bring legislative drafters together with talented poets and writers. And so I worked with the literary development agency Spread the Word. Spread the Word work with underrepresented writers. And they put me in touch with some really fantastically talented writers, and actually very successful writers. And we were going to explore, in the set of collaborative sessions, we were going to explore the similarities and differences between writing and drafting. The point of this project was to try to de-exceptionalize legislative drafting, try to take it off its pedestal, try to understand it as a form of writing that a wider group of people, the wider public, could understand as a craft, instead of thinking that it was something shadowy and too expert for them to get to grips with. And so one of the outcomes was going to be a set of pieces of writing done by these writers about statutes. And another outcome was going to be some sessions with school children writing their own laws. Unfortunately, despite some really good reviews, this project wasn't funded. But I think what's really interesting is that it was trying to go with the questions that really came up about legislative drafting, but in crossing disciplines, it perhaps was too confrontational for legal reviewers. The other project is the Future of Legal Gender project, which was mentioned in the introduction. And in this project, we try to explore the potential effects of decertifying gender in British law. So decertifying gender means that the state would no longer stand behind sex and gender as a legal marker. So sex would be removed from birth certificates, which it's currently on birth certificates, but race and other characteristics of social life are not on birth certificates. So what would happen if you took sex and gender off birth certificates? And we're trying to draft an experimental statute or prototype to show how this might happen. And we're engaging with feminist legal scholars, NGOs, and legislative drafters. What's come out of that has been a set of debates about how we as feminist legal scholars engage with an area of practice that is has deeply ingrained norms and professional values. What happens when you try to engage with that? If you don't follow those rules, do you fall outside of what they think is okay? Do you fall outside what they think their practice is? And I'll come back to that in a second. And the final project that I'm aware of, and I've been very tangentially involved with, is a project that's been led by Aoife O'Donoghue, Mairead Enright, Catherine O'Rourke, and Liam Thornton. And this is the Feminist Constitutional Futures for Northern Ireland project. And what they're doing is they're trying to bring about new interventions in feminist constitutional drafting and design. They're trying to clarify obstacles to constitutional design from a feminist perspective. And they're trying to lay the foundations for practical experiments that can inform future community practice and prefigure alternative legal futures. What are some of the themes that have come out of feminists making statutes? The first theme is that legal form is alive. It's there for us to grasp as feminist legal scholars. And even if we might not ourselves want to be involved in a normative project, taking the insights of feminists who have tried to engage with drafting as something that they can grasp means that we can think about drafters, professional drafters, in a different way. So legal form can be a matter of experimentation and innovation, whether you're a professional drafter or whether you're somebody who's trying to grasp it for a different reason. feminist attempts at legislative drafting tend to break down the barriers between policymaking and drafting, whereas professional drafters at the moment, as we've seen from the debate about the shadows and the debate about the tins and what's in the tin and things like that, try to keep those very separate. And I think that's really interesting that feminists are happy to go there. Part of the work that feminists have to do in engaging with legislative drafting is to widen the angle of analysis. So see, perceive, hear, feel the law differently. And we need to be aware of the dynamics of professional values and current institutional frameworks of drafting and how they might impact on our work. They might impact on the way our work is reviewed. They might impact on the way our work is received by policymakers. There may be some ways in which trying to push new forms of drafting is seen as not being legitimate knowledge creation. And that's going to bring up interesting questions then about what the norms are. And finally, all of this helps us to understand how legal language makes sex and gender seem real. So with all of that in mind, thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to the debate.
Thank you, Emily, but please stay. And again, thank you very much for this inspiring talk and these lots of thoughts we got. And I think there are lots of relations as well to our own plans, as we are planning in a way of rewriting legal somethings. I don't know exactly what we will take, but it's one of our ideas to engage with different publics as well, to do this within our group as well in the next 3 years. And maybe Susanne can say a little bit more about it. What came to my mind was one, and I'm just talking as long as hopefully people begin giving us questions in the chat as well. We have some 15 minutes left for a Q&A. And but what I was thinking about, or what came to my mind, is that there is a little parallel between the writing culture debate in anthropology and your approach on bringing the writing in as one of the main practices in legal everyday life, I would say, or into the fore, and to see what happens there, and what performative power is in it, as you call it, crafty power or something, and how we can intervene in this process as feminists is really interesting. What I would like to know, as long as I don't see any questions in the chat, please go for it. Could you a little bit more go deeper in the differences you see between crafting and writing? I would really like to, I think that this crafting is more like a beginning, and then it's rewritten, but writing as well is a lot of drafting in it. So I don't see really where this border between the two can be drawn in a way.
Thank you. This is a really interesting question. First of all, thank you for the reference to the writing culture debates in anthropology, and I'll go back to that, and that's incredibly helpful. So I really appreciate that. In terms of the differences between crafting and writing, I don't know what those differences are yet, because I've not done enough interviews with drafters. I still intend to put them into conversation with writers, because I know, for example, there was an interview with the chief legislative drafter in a civil service magazine recently, and it mentioned, the person who did the interview mentioned that was on this person's door was a set of limericks that the drafters had written on a social day. And it just shows how they are interested in language. They're interested in writing little poems when they have a day together to socialize. And there is an immense amount of attention paid to punctuation, syntax, clarity. And all of the drafting guides that are available online from, for example, the Office of the Parliamentary Council are fascinating, because they're very sparse. They try to be very clear, but they're one of the first things that they ask you to do in the drafting guidance of the Office of the Parliamentary Council, and I don't know whether it's the same with German drafters, is that they say that you've got to tell a story. So you've got to work out what the narrative is in the statutes, and you've got to know where the beginning, middle, and end is. You've got to tell a story. So there is even understanding of narrative progression there. The drafting expert Helen Zanthaki talks about drafting as being phronesis, which is a particular technical word, as I understand it, for something that is somewhere between art and science. So it is true that you can never get away from legal knowledge when you're drafting, that it's not entirely creative. And this is where what this inquiry speaks to what you were talking about early on, about how do we make understanding law speak back to the social sciences and humanities? What is it that a sociological understanding of law can do in those debates? And I think that one of the things that this can do in this debate is to say, well, in this is lawyers have occupied this craft and made it their own, and they've made it technical and scientific, because if you, for example, express a time limit in the wrong way, there's going to be legal consequences. So okay. I'll just leave it there.
Yes, okay. So now I have a lot of questions in the chat, and I start reading the first, which comes from Sabine Hark, one of our colleagues in the group. Thank you for an inspiring and insightful keynote lecture. You spoke a lot about the manufacturing of law and of the ontological effects of law and statutes. Could you add a few remarks on the conference theme of manufacturing collectivity via law?
So thank you, Sabine. I think really the way that my research speaks to this conference theme is that interwoven with all of the socio-legal assemblages that people are focusing on in this interdisciplinary, international research conversation about law, collectivity, and gender, for example. Interwoven with all of that is statutory law. And what I'm trying to say here is that the way that we understand social groups, the way that we understand equalities, the way that we understand gender as a social construct is not just entirely social, it is at least partly legal. And so what I'm trying to unpick is the role of these written documents in social understandings of conflicts, for example. So when I interview legislative drafters on, for example, what's called in the UK gender neutral drafting, there is huge conflict over, for example, the use of the singular they. So in social life, in English speaking life, it is sometimes good practice to use they instead of him or her. Legislative drafters have huge trouble with this. Some are very, very in favour of it, some of it are very against it. This is one example of the way that legal technical debates that look really arcane are at the same time closely related to and impact upon social debates about, for example, gender, because these are the people who are writing the statutes that keep reproducing the legal norms about gender that many of us are trying to focus on and unpick. So I suppose that's one way of kind of speaking back to your question, which I'm really grateful for.
Okay, we have a next one by Sébastien Dreblé. I don't know whether I pronounce it correctly, sorry for that, but he wrote, thank you very much for such an inspiring talk. I have learned a lot. I have a question regarding your interest for the visual. I was wondering what was the role you give to the interpretation of the visual through a reading by our senses looking at a legal text, and the interpretation of law through our reading of the text in its textual form. How do you think these two readings might differ, and how could it tell us something about different layers of understanding happening simultaneously? What would tell us about the connection between the senses, emotions, and the law?
So there's a lot going on in that question. And the first thing is that there is a distinct set of questions about the visual primacy of the way that people understand statutes. And that is, I'm not posing that as a normative proposition, because the visual is problematic. The visual closes down a wide range of other encounters with law, for example, sensory encounters with law, and it closes down an understanding of the way that objects and materiality create legal worlds. So if we just focus on the visual, we might not understand how legal worlds are designed, that or we might not understand how, for example, new forms of software obviate particular legal innovations because they just become dilemmas of design rather than law. So your question leads me to think about really the fact that I think this is a problem, that the visual aspect of statutes is a problem that I'd like to unpick, rather than something that I think is in and of itself something we should continue focusing on. The connection between the senses and emotions and law can really be found if we engage with the materiality of statutes. And this kind of comes on to one of the other questions from Petra, which is about software. So it would normally be the case that we would have maybe 10, 15 years ago engaged with statutes, whether we read them as visually normative people, or whether we read them as people with sign language, with Braille, for example. They would have been documents that we would have held in our hands. And with software, the entire material interaction has changed. And I've got a whole thing on software, which I don't know if you've got time to go into, but software is increasingly mediating what drafters do. And it's also mediating the way that individuals encounter the legislative text as well. Then we need to think about, what is the materiality of the legislative text? If it's not a document, is it an encounter with somebody's computer? Is it an encounter with their phone? What's happening there? And so that's also engaging with conversations in anthropology about documentary cultures and materialities as well. So I would like to say that it is important to focus on touch and feeling in relation to law, and there's a huge amount of work that can be done with that, and that's really where empirical research becomes very important. And that's also where doing ethnographic work can sometimes be very helpful, because it forces us to understand how those things happen within the everyday cultures and lives of the people who are doing the drafting.
So there's another question by our colleague Petra Sussner. Mm-hmm. She writes, "Thank you so much for this inspiring keynote, drafting such a fascinating research area. My question is about technique and technology. You mentioned drafting as a form of art, but also pointed out how drafting is understood as a technical expertise. I once had the opportunity to observe a seminar for legal writers, and to my surprise, it basically was about software. Do you have any thoughts on the relation of technique and technology in the area of legal drafting and writing?" And she adds that the seminar was for legal drafters of course. So,
thank you, Petra, for that question. And yes, I don't have any very well-formed thoughts as yet. I've started researching the major software companies who specialize in drafting software. And I'm trying to understand how drafters work with software. And that's quite difficult when you don't have access to drafters in their normal everyday lives. When you're relying on interviews, it's not always possible to understand what they're doing in a process sense. But it's still possible to understand a lot about what software companies think they're doing and what they think legal knowledge is. and to understand a bit about how software is changing drafters' practice. Because I know from interviewing some legislative council in London, for example, that they'll still print things off and go off into a room and read it and mark it up. On the one hand, there's what the people who design the software think people are going to be doing, and then there's what people are actually doing on the ground. But thank you for that. It's very helpful.
And Susanne Baer writes a read to the common and civil law drafting. She writes, there is a Gesetzgebungslehre and a tradition of praise for the form of the statute, das Gesetz, as a value in itself. This could be interesting to your work. However, there is a quality check in Ministry of Justice, but drafting in many places, including lawyers commissioned to draft law. In Germany, statutes are interpreted based on the clauses that define goals, as well as the intent of the legislature. Difficult to find and controversial because this may block adequate interpretation in time. And later, I don't know, she wrote something else. I maybe go for this too. In Germany, there are rules on drafting too, and a controversy around language. Equality law calls for gender neutral wording, but it is largely ignored, which is interesting as such.
That's fascinating. Thank you. That's so helpful. It gives me a lot to think about. The quality check is very interesting. And the praise for the form of the statute is absolutely what I'm interested in looking at. And gender neutral drafting in the German context is something I'm very interested in learning a lot more about. Yeah, thank you.
Very interesting in comparison to the English language, yes. Then we have another question by Alik Matsukatov, one of our colleagues as well. Just a remark you might want to elaborate on. Your project seems to be great to remove methodological binaries between practice, meaning, and materiality. Thanks for your keynote. That's
great. Thank you. It's a constant dilemma for any of us involved in empirical research, isn't it?
Yes. Yes, I think he is more saying that it's helpful to go beyond these usually separated areas of research to bring them together in your work. Yeah. So I've understood it like this way, but maybe. So we have another question by Martin Lücke, again, a colleague from historical studies. And our group. Thank you for your hints on using historical methods for analyzing statutes as a historical archive. Besides this, we also find much material on concrete court cases in history. Do you think this might be a set of material too? Reconstruct what you call legal form is alive in history?
I see what you're suggesting there. That's really interesting in the sense that we might look at the way the statute is formed and the debates about the statute itself, and then look at how the statutes are interpreted in the cases. And that's a way that they travel, as well as looking at how statutes influence each other, which is absolutely right. Yeah, that would be a very good way of doing it. Yeah.
And I think we have the last question, because our time is unfortunately is running. It's like usual after such interesting keynotes. So Johanna Wenkebach wrote, thank you so much. You might be interested. The first try to change to feminine form in the legal text in German legislation was stopped, but the conflict about the language of drafters made it into the New York Times, and she posted a link.
Oh, maybe that's fantastic.
Can just check it there.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much. I'll definitely, because that's just exactly the kind of conflict I'm interested in.
Okay, so it's my pleasure to thank you again, and I hope we will see you in a minute in the Wonder Room. The link is posted in the chat. You can find it there, and you have it as well in your email with the participation details. I just want to thank you again for this rich talk, and I think it was a great start for our conference.